I think we'll get started. Let me welcome you to this afternoon's panel on women in conflict and peacemaking. And I'll introduce our very distinguished panel in a moment. I just wanted to introduce myself and the rationale for the panel as well. I'm Jennifer Welsh. I'm one of the professors here at the EUI in the Social and Political Sciences Department. And I've also been working for a number of years on issues related to civilian protection in particular in my own work, and more recently in a position I had at the UN as a special advisor on the responsibility to protect. The idea behind this particular panel for the State of the Union was really inspired by the Security Council's path-breaking resolution in the year 2000 on women in peace and security. And that resolution, which was passed, a thematic resolution that was passed by the Council, recognized the different ways in which women are affected by conflict, that they're affected differently, but also the resolution spoke about the different ways that women can be involved in the prevention of conflict, the resolution of conflict, and also post-conflict peace building. And so in thinking about this panel, I wanted to bring together a group of scholars and practitioners which could help us understand those different dimensions. And indeed, the impact of Security Council Resolution 1325 is now being tracked annually in terms of a report, but there's also been a retrospective study of what we've achieved. And as you can probably predict, the message of that retrospective has been some progress has been made, but there's much more work to be done, particularly in terms of including women actively in the resolution of conflict, but also something that has been discussed in relation to the resolution, seeing women occupy more senior roles in international peace and security organizations and in humanitarian organizations. And that is a battle that is still ongoing. But I would say from a UN perspective, I think one of the little known facts about our current Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, is that he has been particularly interested and committed to putting women into senior positions within the United Nations and made significant impact in that respect. But I certainly don't want to do all the talking because the four panelists are much more interesting than I am. So I'm going to quickly introduce them, but we're also going to structure the panel so that we leave some opportunity for those of you in the audience. I know there are a number of you interested in these issues, working on these issues, to join in the conversation. So let me just begin with a short bio of each of them, and then I've asked them to speak for 10 to 12 minutes maximum each, and I'm going to be very strict timekeeper. And then we'll open it up to questions. So firstly, we have Patricia Sellers, who's a special advisor for prosecution strategies to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She is an international criminal attorney and also a visiting fellow at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford, where she lectures on international criminal law. She served as a legal advisor and a trial attorney at international criminal tribunals in the former Yugoslavia and also in Rwanda, and has served as an expert consultant to UN bodies addressing children and armed conflict, gender and women's rights, and internal investigations. And she's received multiple awards for her work, including the American Society of International Law's Prominent Women in Law Award. Second, we have Dineke de Vos, who's a PhD researcher here at the EUI. I was delighted to get to know her over the last couple of months. She's in the law department, and her thesis is examining the interactions between the ICC and national accountability processes for sexual violence crimes in Colombia, but also in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's worked for civil society, the ICC, and in academia she has experience monitoring and evaluating the legal, practical, and institutional obstacles to the effective investigation and prosecution of sexual and gender-based violence. Then we have at the far end of the table, turning more to the conflict resolution and negotiation theme, Karen Agastam, who's a professor of political science at Lund University and an honorary professor in Australia at the University of Queensland. She is an interdisciplinary researcher who looks into conflict analysis, peace building, gender, and I think fascinatingly for our discussion, negotiation and mediation. And she is directing a research project specifically at the moment on women, gender, and peace mediation, and is editing a book on women, diplomacy, and international negotiation. She is also has been involved, as her bio indicates, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and examining mediation in the context of that conflict. And then lastly, I'm delighted that we have Ellie Schlein, who's a member of the European Parliament, but from Bologna, so not too far from home. And she's in the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. She was elected in 2014. And she is the vice chair of the delegation to the EU-Albania Stabilization and Association Parliamentary Committee and a member of the Committee on Development. She is also a lawyer. She has a degree from the University of Bologna, and she was also active there in several student political movements. But also, as Ellie was describing to me, she's been particularly involved recently, and she'll comment on this, on the migration crisis, what I like to call the global migration crisis, as opposed to just the European migration crisis, and looking at the particular place of women as refugees and asylum seekers. So I think you'll agree this is a very good lineup for our topic. I'm very eager to hear what the panelists want to bring to the discussion, and I'm going to hand it over first to Patricia. Let's get you. Could you hear me? Closer. It's not working. There we go.
It's not working? Okay, is that better? Right. I want to start our panel off today by discussing something that, on the one hand, might seem a bit gruesome, genocide, but on the other hand, something I'm extremely hopeful about, and that is the development of the crime of genocide, circling back to what I call its roots, and actually now sprouting forth in order to give us greater protection as the international community. Due to horrific events that have occurred in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, and let us keep in mind what is occurring with Yazidi today in Iraq, the Genocide Convention has come down from the mountain written in stone, but now has become a type of living crime. We're looking at genocide in several manners. One is based upon customary law emanating from the treaty, and one is a genocide convention as it's been found in provisions of courts and tribunals such as Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and the International Criminal Court. I'm often asked the question quite cynically, meaning that the question is asked so that the person who asked me the question can answer the question, thinking that I don't know the answer, or whatever answer I get, it's not the one they want, is, well, what has international justice ever done for women? And I would answer that it's done a lot, but I think that the question that's more pertinent is what have women done for international justice? And I would say unmeasurable contributions to the development of international criminal law. And I would just like to state 3 different examples. The first is quite well known. It's the Akiyesu case, which was the first case from the Rwanda tribunal, and it was a case in which Tutsi women who were sexually violated prior to being killed were seen to have had 2 acts of genocide committed against them. One was the killing, and one was the sexual violence under the genocide provision in the statute of causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. That was a phrase that was attributed to the act of their rape to make that an act of genocide. Now, the Genocide Convention had this provision in it since 1948. It had always been referred to under all the commentaries for genocide as a provision that related to the reproductive and the torture experiments that were conducted against persons in the concentration camps within Germany and also within Poland. It was never used explicitly as a provision for rape, but for sexual experimentation. It is the Tutsi women who have given us a new and deeper understanding of the genocide doctrine, of why we would even have a provision like that. Example 1. Example 2 also comes from Rwanda. One of the cases that came out of Rwanda that is very little understood or talked about is the Nihimana case. Sometimes it's referred to as the media case. When one talks about it, they like to cite the fact that 2 defendants were found guilty of public and direct incitement to cause genocide. And they caused it because it was via propaganda. They owned a newspaper and a radio station, and they propagandized against Tutsis. And this propaganda was seen to be direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Among the things that they propagandized about was sexually how one should rape Tutsi women, or how one should sexually abuse Tutsi women even if it wasn't rape. Because the court, the tribunal, found that that was an act of direct and public incitement to commit genocide, the sexual propagandizing against Tutsi women, it was part of the finding of guilt of the 2 accused. But let me explain that further. The Genocide Convention, as incorporated into the Rwanda statute, is basically composed of 5 different types of genocide crimes. There's a crime of genocide, there's a crime of attempt to commit a genocide, there's a crime of conspiracy to commit genocide, there's a crime of complicity in genocide, and there's a 5th crime called direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Now, if you notice, the last 4 genocide crimes in this genocide family of crimes, a genocide does not have to occur. Hopefully it doesn't. You can attempt to commit a genocide, and thank goodness the genocide doesn't occur, but you can still be guilty for the substantive crime of attempt to commit genocide. You can have direct and public incitement to commit a genocide, and hopefully the genocide doesn't occur, but you can still be guilty for the direct and public incitement of the genocide. In the Rwanda situation, the genocide did occur, but nonetheless, the 2 accused were guilty of direct and public incitement to commit genocide as well as other acts of genocide. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that sexual propagandizing of the Tutsi women, things saying you should know what a Tutsi woman tastes like, this sexual propaganda really enlivened or enlivened, I'm not quite certain even how to say that in English, or gave a greater depth to what we understand as the genocide doctrine. Why we don't even want people to directly and publicly incite others to commit genocide via sexual propaganda. And we should try and understand that. And at times when women are being sexually demonized in a group that is undergoing extreme crisis, we have to understand our genocide doctrine to say, are they falling into a direct and public incitement of a genocide via the sexual language? It is women who have made us rethink our protections from genocide. And then the last example that I'll give in terms of the Genocide Convention is that we often think of the Srebrenica massacre, and some politically still say it wasn't a genocide, as basically a body count of 7,000 to 8,000 men. Well, the first cases focused on that. But what they also started to focus on, by the time we've had about 7 or 8 cases concerning Srebrenica, is that we started focusing on the men who were to be killed, but who miraculously somehow survived. Was an act of genocide perpetrated against them? And the tribunal, the judges started to say, well, maybe what they had perpetrated against them was causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Even though they physically survived, they weren't killed, there was certainly mental harm, and some were wounded, and the intent to destroy them in whole or part, to kill them, was present. So they took a ruling, basically, that had been developed in Akayesu because of women who had been sexually brutalized prior to being killed, and said, we can apply that to the men who survived. And then they decided, well, can't we apply that same provision to the men who were killed, but prior to them being killed, didn't they go through the mental anguish of knowing they were about to be not just killed, murdered, but part of a genocide population? So those men also, in quotes, even though they were dead, benefited from the ruling that first came about by women. The women who were deported out of the Srebrenica region, it was asked, well, didn't they too suffer an act of genocide? And at the beginning, the tribunal said no, that deportation might have been evidence of an intent to commit genocide, but it could not be seen as an act of genocide, deportation. As the jurisprudence developed, the trial chambers started to understand, well, the women, mainly women and children and elderly men, those who were not to be killed, they too had suffered causing serious mental harm by being separated from male relatives who they knew they would die. Later on in the Kirstage judgment, the trial chamber then said that the killing of the men directly affected the ability of the Srebrenica Muslim community to procreate in the future. And so subsequent Srebrenica cases were tried with not just the killing of the men and the mental anguish of the men who survived the genocide, or those who didn't survive the genocide but had mental anguish prior to being killed, but also with the women who were deported out, their mental anguish. And then the jurisprudence is starting to develop, well, doesn't that community exist in a mental anguish now? The question is, what is the real timeline of the Srebrenica genocide? Is it not continuing due to the mental anguish related to procreation? Now, those three examples I've given you is to show what women, and in many ways what a feminist approach to the Genocide Convention has offered and legated to the international community. When we think of the Yazidi events that are occurring now, we shouldn't just think of the men and the boys who are being killed. We can think of the females who are also being sexually violated. We can think of the mental anguish of the females prior to being killed, prior to being violated. And we can go down to another act of genocide, which I have not talked about today, and that's the fourth act of genocide under the crime of genocide, and that's transferring children to a different group. So if the young girls were transferred with the intent to destroy in whole or part the Yazidi population, and even if they were never touched, if they were never sexually assaulted, but just by the fact that they were transferred to the other group so that there would be no procreation possibilities of the Yazidi group of children, then an act of genocide has occurred. The contribution, in many ways, of women to the genocide doctrine in the past 20 years allows us now to more fully and more completely see genocide before our eyes. These types of precedents have been used in Guatemala in their national court cases in terms of genocide, have also been seen when we're looking at genocides that are happening concurrently now or past ones that have happened, such as in Australia within the stolen generation, when we look in the United States of Native Americans who were forced to relocate, their children separated from them. So the contribution, the question to ask me is, what have women contributed to international criminal law, to genocide? And my answer is plenty, sufficient, and it's still an ongoing endeavor that we should all be respectful of. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A really provocative set of comments and a lot to think about that I know myself I would like to follow up with some questions, so I'm sure that you will also have some of your own. Let me turn straight away to Denica, who's using some PowerPoint slides to help with her presentation. And as I was mentioning when I was reading her bio, she's working very actively on interactions between the ICC and national accountability processes, and she's going to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Patricia, for this very interesting presentation on the international level. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm a PhD researcher here in the third year in the law department, and I have a background in international relations and international law, where I focus specifically on women's rights and gender justice issues. Before I started my PhD here in 2013, I worked for a number of years for an NGO working on gender justice issues in international criminal law, specifically regarding the International Criminal Court. And I've also more recently spent some time working at the ICC in The Hague. Now, my research here at the UI, as Jennifer mentioned, is on interactions between the national and international, and it focuses specifically on the role that the ICC plays in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Colombia around sexual violence accountability. So what I want to do in my presentation today is to shift our focus from the international, which Patricia spoke about so eloquently, to the national level, and just to shift our perspectives a little bit. The creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002 was a very important moment for the field of international criminal justice, especially regarding sexual violence. The statute that establishes court, called the Rome Statute, contains the most advanced articulation at that time and still of sexual and gender-based violence within international criminal law, and it contains a wide range of other provisions around the need for justice to be gender sensitive and around the need to have specific expertise. Now, the International Criminal Court cannot be the panacea for justice after conflict. It doesn't have the resources to prosecute anyone anywhere, and nor should it. So this is reflected in the importance that the Rome Statute gives to states and to national accountability processes. When states were negotiating the Rome Statute that establishes court in 1998, they were very reluctant to give away all of their sovereignty to an independent prosecutor with basically unchecked powers. Previous international tribunals that had been established, the Rwanda Tribunal, the Yugoslav Tribunal that Patricia spoke about by the UN Security Council in the early 1990s, they had primary jurisdiction, which meant that they could take cases from the domestic courts and adjudicate them at the international level. So when they were negotiating, states talking about the possibility of establishing a permanent international criminal court with potentially worldwide reach, this made them a little nervous. So the compromise that they ended up reaching during the negotiations was that the ICC would be a court of last resort. So its jurisdiction is complementary to domestic jurisdictions, which means that the ICC can only exercise its jurisdiction where national systems are unable or unwilling genuinely to investigate or prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. So what this means is that the Rome Statute didn't just create that international court, but it also created a system of justice that's administered jointly by the international level together with the national level, and possibly the national level has an even more important role to play. So the international is inextricably linked to the national level. I want to draw on a specific example from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to explain a little bit more how I see these interactions happening. Sexual violence has been notoriously widespread in the protracted armed conflict has plagued the DRC since 1996. In 2010, Margot Wallström even called the country the rape capital of the world. Now, the estimates vary, but research that came out in 2011 suggested that about 48 women were raped every hour in the DRC. And this situation was exacerbated by continuing impunity, societal factors like stigma and shame, a resistance among the police to deal with these kinds of violence, and the continued presence of armed actors. So it's been incredibly hard in that context for victims of sexual violence to get justice at a national level. But there's some small progress has recently been made in the DRC by transplanting international standards from the Rome Statute to the national level. More specifically, DRC judges have directly used provisions of the Rome Statute in national criminal proceedings. For instance, the case of Songo Maboyo. This case related to an attack on the village of Songo Maboyo in December 2003, where the soldiers pillaged and looted the town in retaliation for not having been paid sufficiently by their commander. And on top of that, they also raped approximately 120 women. This case took place in 2003, and in 2006, it led to an investigation and subsequently a prosecution and trial before the military court. In this case, the military judges recognized deficiencies in Congolese law around sexual violence and the capture capacity and the limited recognition of these types of crimes in Congolese law. So what they did instead was that they used that Rome Statute, that international standard, to try and amend and correct those kinds of gaps and biases. So what they did was they relied on the Rome Statute to argue and to find that for the purpose of Congolese law, rape was also a gender-neutral crime, meaning it can be committed by men and women and it can be committed against men and women. And on top of that, they also used the Rome Statute around ruling that rape could be enacted as a crime against humanity. And all of that was a much more progressive understanding of rape and other forms of sexual violence than was available at that time in Congolese law. Now, fast forward about 8 years, and by now the Rome Statute has repeatedly been used by various military court judges to correct gender biases or address gaps in Congolese law. And in many instances, it's made a tangible difference for victims of sexual violence in terms of their access to justice and the recognition of the harm they've suffered. Another example in this respect is the Minova case, which relates to a mass rape by the Congolese armed forces in the town of Minova in November 2012. When this case came to court in 2014, the military judges again used the Rome Statute, this time around protective measures for victims of sexual violence, and particularly for the witnesses that were testifying. Congolese penal law states and holds that the court shall take all necessary measures to ensure the safety, security, and well-being of its witnesses. But it doesn't specify what kind of measures those could be, other than the use of a closed session, which is where a hearing is held behind closed doors, away from the eyes and the ears of the public. So by relying on the Rome Statute, this allowed the court to arrange for a much broader set of protective measures to protect these witnesses that were testifying. But at the same time, what was very interesting is that they adapted that international standard that they took from that document, they adapted it or translated it to the national context. And what do I mean with that? The International Criminal Court is based in The Hague, and it has very sophisticated technological systems available to protect witnesses' identity from the public. For instance, they can use voice distortion, face distortion, they have specific screens or other availabilities within the courtroom to ensure that the victim and the witness who testifies is completely shielded from the public gallery. So not from the accused person, but from the public gallery. Now, the Minova case took place in the DRC before a so-called mobile court, which means that the military judges traveled to the remote location of Minova to hold the trial locally rather than in a courtroom that was located miles away. So it's bringing the court to the people as opposed to the people to the court. And while this meant that the hearing was much more accessible to a lot of people because it was where lots of the victims were based, so it became much more accessible. Justice became more accessible. They could see it in action. But it also meant that they were holding hearings in schools and marketplaces. So when this is your courtroom, how do you protect your witnesses? Or when this is where your witnesses arrive, how do you shield their identity from the public? Where you have to realize that this was still a context of ongoing violence and ongoing armed conflict, where just outside this school could be a base of some of the rebel groups who had attacked these very women who were testifying. So the risk to these women is very real in this situation. So the translation that happened, they really wanted to use that international standard, was by having women appear veiled with sunglasses, or as you can see here, some sort of weird, I don't even know what it is, cover over their heads with ears and a microphone. Some of the women also wore wigs and big sunglasses to try and shield their identity from the public. And others were allowed to give testimony behind the curtain, and again with the same kinds of protections, but also behind a screen, so that also they didn't have to actually face the accused person when that was too much for them to bear. So this was very creative, and in many ways it facilitated victims' ability to come and testify in these courts. And that creativity really mattered, because you need judges and lawyers who are willing to be creative and think through how international standards that have been developed in international criminal law, how those can work in a national system with the limitations that you have. And it also, in a way, created a better sense of a local ownership of the process, because because it was their conversations. They were thinking through how that could work in their own context, and that helps to have such processes really stick in national legal practices, and that's ultimately what you want in trying to improve domestic legal systems with an international standard. So you want things to become integrated as an integral part of the practices that people rely upon, rather than it being seen as imposed from above. And perhaps most importantly, the process of harmonizing that national legal process and national law with international standards opened up a space to talk about sexual violence that didn't exist before. So the interesting thing is here in the DRC, and I've seen it in other contexts as well, is that the Rome Statute is transforming from a document that established that International Criminal Court to something more like a human rights convention, where we're holding states accountable to the extent to which they harmonize their national laws, policies, and practices with international standards. So this suggests that the ICC is expanding in all kinds of different ways that we wouldn't have expected when the court was first created. But it's not an unmitigated good to rely upon this international standard just like that. One of the difficulties in the DRC, but I've seen it also in Colombia, is that through relying on the move to harmonize national law with international practices has created a somewhat artificial distinction between sexual violence as an international crime, where we apply these new and improved standards, and so-called normal sexual violence that happens in so-called times of peace. Also those are arbitrary words, but just to make the distinction between the two. And it risks downplaying those ordinary sexual and gender-based harms. Now, of course, so the attention paid to sexual violence as a war crime and a crime against humanity, which is where all the resources were being poured into, hasn't translated into that same kind of attention for sexual violence as a phenomenon as such, and in terms of the reasons behind the violence. But in the DRC, there's research that suggests that the dramatic increase in sexual violence in conflict also led to an increase in sexual violence committed by civilians, including intimate partner violence, which suggests that there's a normalization of rape. Yet all the resources are being poured into addressing sexual violence as an international crime. So what this case really shows is that we need to remember that transitional justice processes don't happen in a vacuum, and international criminal law cannot be applied in the abstract, particularly not at a national level. It's important to address sexual violence as that international crime, as a war crime or a crime against humanity or as genocide, because it recognizes the context in which these crimes are committed. But in order for these processes to really have that truly transformative impact that we'd ultimately want prosecution and investigations to have in terms of transitioning into a situation of peace and relative stability, we need to pay attention to the links with broader questions of transitional justice, such as reparations or truth-telling, and broader questions of the structural inequalities that create environments in which sexual violence is almost accepted. The emphasis through the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been heavily skewed towards criminal justice. Such internalization of these international practices, as with the protective measures, is really important, but they're only first steps towards navigating the complex terrain that is a post-conflict situation. Thank you.
Thanks very much to both of you. I think just before we move on, I wanted to make just a couple of observations. It's interesting when we think about the different ways that women are affected by conflict, that it's not only related to women themselves and their physical integrity, but also, as Patricia was suggesting, to the treatment of their families and their children, and that's an important dimension. And I think what also came out of the two presentations is the degree to which we've, as a result both of events but also of real efforts of advocates and lawyers and others, been forced to think through what the particular crimes that are committed against women demand in terms of justice, both at a conceptual level but also at a very practical level. But it's also important in this context, as Patricia suggested, to remember that we are not talking about history only. We're also talking about the very current. I recently saw a report that was done by the U.S. Holocaust Museum on the events and the crimes perpetrated against the Yazidi, and was at a conference where this was being discussed. And one of the more poignant stories was actually from one of the UN human rights officials in Iraq, who said that at the time the Yazidi community was stranded on Mount Sinjar, he was receiving calls from mothers on the top of the mountain. So we have to remember it's the 21st century. People have saying that unless the international community came to help them, they were going to kill their daughters because they didn't want the option of what was going to happen to them at the hands of their captors in ISIS to unfold. And this is not history. This is very current reality. So I think it's a backdrop for our discussion that we're talking about what has been done, but we also need to think about, from an ongoing perspective, what we continue to need to do. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit more about the role of women in post-conflict situations, but also in the resolution of conflict. And one of the very interesting benchmarks that was set by Security Council Resolution 1325, and it's been picked up on by civil society and others, is that women should be at the table in various ways in mediation and negotiation and bringing resolution to conflicts. And so Karen's been doing some very interesting research on those kinds of initiatives. I hope she'll also talk a little bit, if not in the presentation and Q&A, about what's difference she thinks that makes, because I think these conversations also can be enriched by that discussion. Certainly we've heard from Patricia what difference it makes in thinking about these crimes and international justice. So Karen, let's turn it over to you.
Everybody can hear me? Yes? Okay, many thanks for the very kind invitation to attend this very exciting conference on a critically important theme, and thanks very much, Jennifer, for inviting me to this panel. This is also so topical with such distinguished presenters here as well. I think also the program here, the conference program, really reflects how gender is also this kind of cross-cutting theme that we all need to relate and reflect upon. My presentation will focus very much on the research that we are doing in a newly launched research project on gender and peace mediation and diplomacy. And we raise very basic question in this research project, simply by asking, where are the women in international mediation? This is a very basic question, but strangely enough, hardly dealt with in academia. Very, very few studies on this topic, which is in a way a paradox, because international mediation otherwise works a lot on cultural factor, personality, cognitive, affective factors, but has not really related to gender and women in international mediation. And I want to underline that we are focusing on international mediation. But we can also notice a positive trend since the launching of UN Security Council 1325. So my talk will primarily focus on providing an overview of where women are located in peace mediation, and then move to reflect on some underlying assumptions and arguments in contemporary policy discourses on women's participation, both as mediators as well as negotiators. So we conducted a pilot study a year ago, and the often quoted report showing the striking underrepresentation of women in peace negotiation and peace mediation is often referred to the UNIFEM report that studied 31 peace accords between 1992 and 2011, pointing out very clearly the very few women that we see as chief mediators, 2.5% on the global arena, 9% peace negotiators, and 4% women as signatories to peace accords. Now this reflects, obviously, a very gendered peace processes taking place around the world. And also it reflects the gendered institutions, international institutions, and diplomacy obviously is one institution of this kind. So our pilot study that I conducted together with colleagues in Uppsala, and we have used primarily the Uppsala conflict database that is tracking generally conflict patterns over time. Using that database, we focus then on identifying women participating in track 1 mediation. There are several reports and studies on women on the local level. So we have seen in recent years quite an flourishing field where women participate on the local level, but when it comes to the elite level, to the international level, much less studies has been done. So this relates very much also to women in leadership positions and at the negotiation table. So we identified 36 cases of official chief mediation. And I want to say that these figures are of course shaky in the sense that it all depends on the definitions that we used. And we used still a very wide and broad understanding of international mediation. So that leaves us with 8% of women who participate as chief mediator, according to our data. And we also notice, as you can see in the figure here, a slow, very slow, but still an increase over time, and definitely an increase since 2000 and with UN General Council Resolution, or the General Security Council Resolution 1325. We also notice a great variety when it comes to women's rank, organization, and type of mediation. So we have women being actively involved in as high-ranking representatives in international organizations within the UN, but also lower-level mediation that we have seen, also high-ranking ministers, and also power mediation, for instance, Indira Gandhi, looking back in time, but also Catherine Ashton, and also Madeleine Albright, obviously, and others. I only want to make a comment also on, we have tried to explore also the outcomes of these peace mediation. And first a note that has to be stated is that in most international mediation efforts, the statistic is rather poor in the sense that most efforts, a majority of them are unsuccessful. So it's very difficult to talk about outcomes and correlations and gender and women here. So it's difficult to trace causal here in regards to correlation. But there are interesting studies being done. Christine Bell is one who have looked into peace agreements and the existence of gender provisions in peace agreements. But definitely we need more studies in this area. So if we look on where women are mediating, in the 36 cases that we have, over 50% of the cases related to conflicts in Africa, 22% relates to conflict in the Middle East, and also 19%, these are the large groupings of conflicts that we see. And this follows a very general pattern of international mediation in general. So we don't see a deviation here that women are located to mediate some specific conflicts than others. So it's no real difference here. And also when we look on the type of conflict, both regarding to interstate conflict as well as intrastate conflicts, it follows the same pattern as the general patterns of international mediation. So it's an equal division between governments, conflicts over governments, and conflicts over territory. And obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here sort of stick out here, both because the US have had several women as Secretary of State, as well as the heavily involvement of American administration in this particular conflict. So if we look on who mediates, this is quite interesting figures, and I think this is something that we are unpacking and exploring further. And again, I'm only showing some tentative figures here. This relates strongly to both leadership position and diplomacy, and we see here an over-representation of Nordic countries. And I want to say something more about that later on. But we have 23% of the total numbers coming from Nordic countries, which may reflect, you could say, also the higher degree of gender equality and political representation in these countries, as well as, I would argue, also the strong international commitment and long-term engagement in international organizations such as the UN. So I think that's a correlation there. And obviously, as I was saying before, American women as mediators reflect the fact that they have had, like in our case studies, several Secretary of States mediating, and as I was saying, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then we have also a large number of mediators coming from Africa, as well as I'm mentioning here, Europe. What is interesting, I think, and that's why I think linking to another project that we have together with colleagues in Gothenburg, who looks on also doing path-breaking research, and again, it's striking that this hasn't been done before, but they have mapped women being appointed as ambassadors, and found very interesting results in this regard. Globally, women being appointed as ambassadors, being very senior diplomats, is 15%. But here you can also see, as if you can read, it's a little bit small here on the PowerPoint, but you can see the great regional differences. So, for instance, Nordic countries, it's 35%. Also North America, 25%, whereas if we look on the Middle East and not least Asia, we are going down to 6% and 10% respectively. And I think that's a correlation here between chief international mediators with also senior appointments in diplomacy in general. I would only like to end this brief talk here on a few reflections on the contemporary policy discourses. So, despite the fact that it's now 15 years since 1325 was launched, we still have to say it's poor progress, very poor progress. But at the same time, I would also argue, at least on the rhetorical level and in policy circles and networks, there's also great mobilization. So I would say, for instance, the UN Mediation Support Unit is mobilizing very strongly on gender issues and advising actively. And also, as some of you may know, the present Swedish government with the foreign minister, Margot Wallström, have launched a women's network in cooperation with women in the Global South, where they actively are trying to identify qualified women as mediators, creating a pool, and also working also among the Nordic countries in order to offer the services in order to improve. And as Margot Wallström has been saying, mediation is a weapon for inclusion in peace negotiations. It's a critical position that mediators have. And if you look on the argument presented, obviously, the struggle for representation and empowerment is very, very important because, again, peace negotiation is a window of opportunity. It's opening up opportunities where you can influence the long-term trajectory of peace, and the long-term consequences are obviously there. So, obviously, women should be present, and that's justifiable. And again, the chief mediators are positioned in a very important part of that process of being able to redesign and restructure peace process to include gender expertise. And I think Mary Robinson, and to make a note on the UN, she was the first UN envoy appointed in 2013. So that's how recent the UN took this 13 years after the 1325 was accepted. Also, what is now often being argued, and that has been seen also in I would say, in Australia and also in the US and among Nordic countries, is also to argue that by including women both as mediator and as a negotiator, there's a correlation to sustainable peace and durable peace, a resilient peace. And what we found from the peace agreement that had been mediated by women, we did actually find, of the very few cases, so it's a bit shaky again, but we could say that in 50% of the cases, the peace agreement reflected much more gender-sensitive and language in the peace agreement, and also provisions related to women, and that was only 15% when you talk about men. And then finally, I only want to make a note on the UN. Karin Landgren, I think that there have been great efforts done, not least by the Secretary General in regards to gender parity. But last year, there was very disappointing appointments. So of all the senior UN appointments done last year, 92% related to men. So there have been women within the UN who have been calling out that the achievements that have been gained are getting lost again. So we need to keep track and keep on mapping these appointments, I think. And I had a final note here on inclusive mediation and negotiations, but I will leave it for there now. Thank you very much.
Your point at the end, Karen, is well taken. And of course, as we all know, there's big discussions about whether the next Secretary General should finally also reflect over 50% of the world's population in terms of gender. But let's see what happens. Lastly, can I introduce Ellie, our participant here today from the European Parliament. And I hope she will talk a little bit about the work she's currently doing, but also some of the other themes that have come up in the discussion. And I also see she's interested in women in peacekeeping, which is something we didn't have an opportunity yet to discuss. Yes. So, Ellie, I'll turn it over to you. Be nice.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation. Let me start with this. It's a very important occasion what we have today, at least for me. It's very rare, I'm not kidding, for us, for policymakers, to have a possibility to have a confrontation like this on very important matters on which, for us, it's extremely important to have a strict contact with the academy, with people who are doing research, who have experience directly in the field, because otherwise, in terms of the policy making that we actually make in the institution, it's not going to be good enough to address effectively these issues. So I will just start with this, and I will I will say I'm sorry, but I have to stick to my notes, because despite my exotic name, I'm Italian. Italian is my own language. So this is still a topic of discussion, which I'm sure we will all prefer to see soon outdated, because unfortunately in May 2016 we still find ourselves discussing the role of women in conflicts, when they or how we can improve their situation, while we would all prefer to put the conflicts to an end at a global level. The UN resolution that was mentioned, 3025 of 2000, is a cornerstone on this issue, because for the first time it states clearly what Jennifer already said, that war affects women differently. As a premise, I must say, I'm not an expert on the role of women in conflict and peacemaking. As a member of the FAM committee and the LIBE committee in the parliament, I'm working mostly on displacement, on women fleeing from conflicts, on the EU policy on asylum and refugees, which I will follow closely as rapporteur on the Dublin reform for my group, the S&D group in the parliament. So I will get back to it shortly at the end. So with regard to peace negotiation, as it was clearly pointed out by Karin, past research has mostly focused on how the inclusion of women in peace negotiation or mediation strategies has an impact on the outcome of such processes, and research has shown that the presence of women in negotiation settings is likely to increase the chances of reaching an agreement when we have those data, those statistics, and also to see and for it to be effective in the long term, of course. Yes, the benefits of including gender issues in the negotiation process have, however, received less attention. The nature of contemporary conflicts targeting civilian population and especially women through sexual violence or displacement renders the gendering of peace negotiation via the use of a gender-sensitive approach and the inclusion of women as negotiators key to the stabilization of post-conflict societies and to the ushering of genuine reconciliation processes. Involving female negotiators is also likely to help preventing a relapse into conflict by giving a voice to players with a significant experience and expertise in peace building at the local level, like some women's organizations, which are usually excluded from the political and security fields in many cases. The explanations for such neglect are numerous. Negotiations are often held in urgency and therefore tend to gather the main military and political leaders, mostly men. Also, many believe that peace processes are gender neutral in the sense that peace benefits all men and women alike, overlooking the fact that just like conflict, peace is gendered as well. Women themselves are sometimes depicted as their own enemies, as many seem to self-exclude from negotiation, believing that men are more competent or knowledgeable on security and political matters, which is not true, clearly. But if women are often not invited to participate in peace negotiation, and if gender-related issues are ignored, it is also because conflicts are still understood as politico-military events and are addressed in a very top-down manner. Those who are seen as legitimate participants in peace negotiations belong mostly to the military and political spheres. So, although there is a wide consensus on the fact that contemporary conflicts cannot be solved via official channels only, the old interstate tools somehow still frame our views of how negotiations should be held. Other factors pertaining to the organization and functioning of women's groups explain why their voices are often muted or excluded. There are sometimes also tension in these groups or within these groups. Another challenge facing women's organization is the fact of representativeness. In a conflict context, very few groups have the opportunity to build a broad-based support, beside the legitimacy acquired via their involvement in grassroots activities. Which section of the population can they claim to legitimately represent in such a context? So the participation of women in peace negotiation, when in some societies they are not even allowed to speak in public, is sometimes so at odds with cultural, local realities that it can generate also strong opposition from the most traditional section of population. Women are said to have specific assets in peace negotiation which favor a better negotiating atmosphere, such a tendency to define themselves through their relationship, through their relation which they seek to maintain and protect during negotiation. These are sometimes also stereotypes or assumptions regarding the role of women in peace negotiation. It has also been argued that, contrary to men, women do not focus on end gains, but rather on processes, and thus favor exchanges conducive to a friendly negotiation settings. But beyond all these sometimes essentialist arguments, which may not be valid across different cultures, including women in peace negotiation is first and foremost a question of fairness and of representativeness of post-conflict populations. Against this backdrop, women's experience of conflict is different, like that of most civilians. It centers around displacement, random killings, and/or systematic ethnic cleansing, gender-based violence, epidemics, kidnapping, forced enrollment, extreme difficulties in finding food and shelter, and so on. So encouraging the participation of women favors the inclusion of these issues that otherwise might be left aside. So just to get shortly to the end, because I would like to react to some of the things I heard. This is why the EU, and specifically the EU Parliament, is always strongly committed in discussing the way the role of women, even in hard security situations, can be rediscovered and reinforced. I think we should not reinforce the image of women as either victims or empathic person. We probably have strong emotional power, but if we simply focus on that, we will reiterate, a different picture from reality, I think, because in a way, we should put at the center, as it was said before, the extremely important contribution that they actually give to this picture we are discussing today. But just shortly, because what Patricia said before made me think about the objectification. Does that word exist at all? Yeah. That's great, I got it correctly. The objectification of the body of women has a role in implicitly legitimating violence against them. So what is more, that is my question to you and for our discussion, what is more objectifying than dealing with the refugees just as numbers? How many they arrive? How many people are dead died in trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, for example, and we lost track of the numbers. By the way, the last news showed that we cannot even count the deaths anymore. That is our harsh reality. So this is the point. While we're talking about women in conflicts and genocide and sexual violence as a weapon of war, we should also keep in mind what Jennifer said. This is not history. This is the present, and it's not far away from us. It's in our societies. How many episodes of violence against refugees are we counting in everyday media across the EU member states in these days? There is a discourse legitimating violence by objectifying women and objectifying refugees in general in these days. So just to say and to conclude, I think that in many ways, women who are displaced are escaping, and if I have to give a comment about it, I think that EU policy on asylum and refugee, but also national policies at the level of member states, are not fit to the purpose, are not gender sensitive at all. I just want to give you two quick examples. I was a couple of months ago in a detention center near Rome. I met hundreds of Nigerian women who were there, where they were not even informed properly on their right to present asylum requests, also related to the sexual violence they had experienced because they had scars. It was very clear. And the authorities, just to tell you an example, there was this woman I met. She was asking for a pregnancy test. You can imagine what lies behind that request. It doesn't take to be an academic or an experienced officer on the field to know. And she had to wait for 10 days when I got there. And I had to make sure myself that she would be given that opportunity. And just to give another example, I presented last week a written request to the Commission, to the European Commission, over the situation in the Chios, in the island of Chios in Greece. You know that there are many refugees there, thanks. There are many refugees there, and I was told by some activists on the field that children were given barely a quarter of a glass of powdered milk, which is not even enough to meet a quarter of what they need daily. And I had to make this question directly to the Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, because I don't think we can accept that this is happening in our European Union. This is against all the values that were at the grounds of our union. So thanks a lot again for this very enriching discussion, and let's see also what they want to ask. I'm happy to answer more deeply on EU policy on migration and refugees. I'm the real expert on that, but on the other issues, I'm very thankful for having met you all, because it was very interesting and very helpful for our work also in the Parliament. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellie, very much for those extremely interesting comments and the passion with which you delivered them. I just wanted to make two comments before I open it up. First, looking at the specific issue of children and refugees today, I found it very interesting in looking at the current discussion and decision that's been made by the UK government to allow unaccompanied children, refugees, to come to the UK. That it's fascinating, those who are sponsoring these bills, these initiatives in the UK, one of them is a man who came to Britain at the age of 6 as a war refugee. And in a way I'm very glad that it's his leadership, but in a way I'm disappointed that it has to be those who experienced it themselves that take the initiative, but I think it's interesting. The other point I wanted to make to round off our discussion, and I hope you'll see what I'm trying to get at, is that we didn't talk about one aspect of this, and I couldn't find the right participant, but also I didn't want to make the discussion too big, to talk about the role of women as combatants. So that, if you're wondering why didn't we talk about that, it wasn't because I didn't think about it. It was because I couldn't get exactly the right person. But I wanted to throw 3 things out in relation to that, and I'm not an expert on this myself, but just to round out our discussion. First of all, there has been actually a taboo or a norm against female combatancy, which of course was shattered in World War II, particularly by the Soviet Union. But we've seen in recent years a lot of debate about women in the armed forces and the impact that they have in military establishments, which I think is an interesting dimension of this. Secondly, the role of women in peacekeeping, specifically in terms of civilian protection. But also, interestingly, women in broader stabilization missions of the UN who are police officers. So one of the more interesting experiences I had, there's this fantastic training center, some of you will know, in Vicenza. We had a participant from there at last year's State of the Union. They train police forces for stabilization missions by NATO, the EU, and the UN. And when I was there, I was at one of their graduation ceremonies. There were 3 police officers, female, from Nigeria, who were graduating and who were returning to take part in stabilization missions, not just in Nigeria, but elsewhere. But lastly, the phenomenon of female foreign fighters. And I have some interesting stats here from our global stat unit at the EUI in terms of the numbers within foreign fighters from the EU traveling to Syria and Iraq. 17% of them are women. And that's interesting. To me, it's a high number. But also looking at where they're going, whether they're going on their own or whether they're going with their spouses. It's a very fascinating phenomenon. And there is, from what I'm aware of, and we'll hear a little bit more about this tomorrow, also in recruitment by ISIS and other groups, specifically on social media, the targeting of young women. And encouragement of them to participate. So I wanted to just throw that in as a comment because it was something absent, which I think is equally interesting in this discussion. But we have a little bit less than 20 minutes, but I might stretch it by 5 for questions from the audience. Maybe what we'll do is we'll take a few hands, and if you could just indicate who you would like to respond, or the whole panel, and then I'll maybe do two rounds. So I have a question here. And yes, let's start.
Yes, this question, we've been talking about the Australian and the Native American lost generation and so forth. It's also happening here in Tuscany. The Roma, who from Romania were taken by the Nazis to Transnistria. It was almost the worst kind of Holocaust because they were left in the open fields to starve without access to water. They died of typhus, starvation, and also cannibalism from the hunger. The grandmothers of the present Roma who are sleeping in the streets in Florence remember walking back as little girls from Transnistria to Romania. We don't know the story, but the children are being taken into care, are separated from their families. The mothers are in anguish. I'm working right now with a mother whose 4 children have been taken. And nothing is done for the mothers, for the fathers. They have to be separated if they want a roof over their heads. They've slept under the loggia of the Innocenti for 6 years since they were sgomberati with bulldozers from Osmanoro. We have here our own kind of genocide. And I'm just hoping that more people can become aware of the story and work on it. And I'm so grateful for your explanation of what genocide is, that it's also the mental anguish of the women. In this case, women who have never had schooling, who are illiterate but intelligent, and human beings like ourselves. Thank you very much.
The ICTY, CTR used creative approaches to expand the definition. Would you consider that we need a resolution of the issue at the interstate level, or is it a matter to be decided on a case-by-case basis by international courts? And a short remark on a personal level, 11 years ago I was an intern at the registry of the ICTY, and it was my first research, sexual violence in war, and I believe Patricia was actually leading this project from the prosecutor's office. So this experience shaped me as an international criminal lawyer, and it's quite inspirational to be here today. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to comment at all, Denika, or should I?
I wanted to respond to something you said.
Okay. Perhaps I'll give the floor first to Patricia, and then Denika, and I don't know if you want to speak specifically about the
Thank you
Roma.
very much
Okay.
for your thank you and for your comment, sister. And I didn't plant you in the audience. I promised this last question here. But if you will notice that about 2 weeks ago, they published some testimony that I gave before the House of Lords. Yeah. And I would like to have the Genocide Convention expanded. There's a difference between having the provisions as they are interpreted now by a judicial body. That's fine, and I'm happy, as I've said in my talk, that interpretation is showing us the breadth and the depth of what is genocide. But the convention itself is being seen as if it were something that is so sacred that it cannot be amended, it cannot have a protocol. And these are the changes that just I would like to see. First of all, there are only 4 groups: racial, ethnic, national, and religious. There is no group of gender. You cannot commit a genocide against a gender, against women. They could certainly expand it by putting in gender, even if they want to say male and female. However one identifies their own gender. They could expand it by having genocide against sexual orientation, because we know in World War II that homosexuals were put in concentration camps. That would almost come from a historic basis, not a politically correct 2016 basis. I think we should also have a genocide group in terms of your gender identity, that we know that trans people have been criminalized just per se as a group. There's no reason that we can't expand genocide to include political genocide. One of the reasons it wasn't put in the original Genocide Convention was because Europe and many parts of the world had colonies, and they didn't want to expand genocide to political because then that might put them, in a difficult position of having the convention ratified by their own national parliaments or congresses. So one thing is, yes, I think it should expand just in the very basic in terms of the groups against whom a genocide could be committed. In addition to that, I think we should expand it in terms of what could be called genocidal acts, the underlying acts of genocide, and I would go as far as to say that we should also expand the types of crimes that could be genocide. The Rome Statute modifies the Genocide Convention via the statute by eliminating the crime of attempt to commit genocide, complicity, conspiracy. They make those liability elements under Rome Statute. The only crime that sustains is direct and public incitement. I think customary law, because not every country unfortunately has signed up to the Rome Statute, if the customary law basis of those other crimes is diluted or not used, and we only have the crimes from the Rome Statute, how they see genocide, that might weaken the overall international community protection.
I wanted to respond to what you mentioned around women combatants and the role that women play in that respect in conflict. It made me think of how women perpetrators of international criminal law, how they are actually treated and how we deal with those. And as far as I'm aware, there's only 3 prosecutions in international criminal law of women perpetrators. One at ICTY, Bojana Plavsic, one at ICTR, Nepali Nirmarsuko, if I pronounce it well, and then there's Simone Bagbo at the ICC, although she's also now being prosecuted at a national level. And there's a really interesting book, I forget the names of the authors now, which is called Mothers, Monsters and Horrors, which looks at the narratives and the very gendered narratives when we talk about women combatants, how that's very much seen as sort of, women are seen as an anomaly because it's not what you're supposed to be as a woman. You're not supposed to be violent, you're supposed to be very caring. So there's lots of those kinds of dynamics as well. So I don't know if there's anyone still looking for a PhD research topic, either here in the room or online, but I think we definitely need more research in the role that women play, but also equally the narratives and how they're perceived as combatants.
Karen, would you like to come in and then Ellie? Yeah, go ahead.
Simply following up on that, I do think that these figures that you mentioned, Jennifer, I think it's very interesting. And also, I don't know if you mentioned this with the female bombers, that it's actually making up 25%, and it's not very much talked about. And I think it's primarily because of these gendered narratives. And I do think that gender and some feminist studies in international relations can give quite interesting explanations about that, because it challenged this general perception of what the feminist academics refer to the just warriors and the beautiful souls, and that is that the men are the active protectors and the women are the victims, the passive ones. And it's challenging this whole notion. And I think Laura Sherby have done some very interesting work in that area, where she actually showed the complexities when it comes to gender roles. And it also, I think, is challenging when it comes to, as you mentioned, with peacekeeping, and that we actually, it's a lot happening in that field, actually, where women also participate, including in combat, more forceful combat operations, I know in Sweden, for instance. So it has changed dramatically in the last decade, but very few studies again on that. So.
Yeah, just very shortly. Yes, it was also in my notes, because I wanted to underline this aspect, because we are in Fiesole, I'm from Bologna, we are in the lands of resistance, when resistance was also female resistant, was in some cases especially female resistant because of the condition of the fights, of the resistance. So I think that yes, it's very punctual that you made out that point in the end, because I also think that the narrative on conflicts, as was already said, is mostly built through male voices. That's why history also about resistance don't give a proper role to women, which they definitely had. And also think about today. We have women combatant on one side. We have today some cases of women's resistance. Let me just mention the famous case of Nesrin Abdallah, the Kurds, I think it's called Women Defense Unit, fighting Kobane against Daesh. So we have also this side of the story, and it's going to be a nice contribution for next year's State of the Union, maybe to address another side. And just to conclude about the, yes, before I was talking about refugees, my mistake, it's not only on refugees. This objectification, this criminalization, Roma people have experienced this for years, for ages, and today in the political debate in Italy it's extremely dangerous and strong. This is what it is. In the European Parliament, at least, we are addressing the issue of anti-Gypsyism. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the national level. We have to do something to improve, because there is a rhetoric which is openly, as I said before, legitimating action of violence against Roma and Sinti, which is very unacceptable today, or ever. But to have it today, as you mentioned, when there is a history behind, it's very painful. And nothing else, I think we have said everything. Oh yes, just one point on the conference. I think that today's conference give us a look of, and the debates, very articulated, show perfectly what needs to be done in order to change this cultural mindset. We don't need, I will say in Italian, many of you understand, we don't need lo sguardo sulle donne, a view on women, a look on women. We need to embrace the look of women, which is very different, lo sguardo delle donne. And this we need to do in all policy making, when developing public policies, because otherwise they will not be effective. And let me conclude with this metaphor. It's like trying to look at society with one eye closed. How can you get a real picture of society and the problems you have to address if you look at it like this? If you don't have also the view on women and how they can contribute to building effective policies to address these problems. Thanks again.
Well, I'm tempted to say on that eloquent note we should end, but we probably have 3 minutes or a few more if there's another question from the audience. I don't see anyone dying to ask. One last question. Okay.
Hello. I'd like to ask Patricia and Dineke. Dineke mentioned in her presentation that the Rome Statute is sometimes perceived as a human rights convention when it influences the domestic proceedings. And my question is, if the developments at the procedural level, developments at the domestic level, do not satisfy what the ICC would think it would be a sufficient level of gender perspective incorporated at the domestic level, how can it intervene, or how can it influence the domestic proceedings, especially in light of a number of judgments where it explicitly mentioned that it is not a human rights court, and in the context of admissibility proceedings at the ICC, it cannot done anything. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. That is, of course, a very important dynamic, also one that has been analyzed extensively. I think we need to think, for me at least, the Rome Statute isn't just about the ICC, but it's about the system that it established as a whole. Of course, the ICC is very limited in what it can do in terms of encouraging or changing practice that happen at a national level. As for the reasons that you mentioned, the admissibility test is fairly restrictive in that sense. And in fact, the test that has been said by judges may also have left a lot of flexibility in terms of especially gender issues. There's been some research by Louise Chappell on that. But in terms of encouraging gender-sensitive practices and interpretation of the law, I think civil society also has a really important role to play in that. And the complementarity part of the ICC falls on the ICC, but it falls also on the states themselves in order to fund programs around capacity building, donor community. It falls on civil society to also take that forward. And in many ways, the ICC really is a different kind of court than ICTY and ICTR, because civil society was so important for the court's establishment that it only makes sense that it is also part of its future. So I think that's maybe where it might be more important to link the development of national capacity with, but also the Office of a Prosecutor. And of course, there's the recent policy paper around sexual and gender-based crimes, where they explain their interpretation of the gender mandate that they've been given through the Rome Statute, and clarifying how the ICC interprets certain things might also have an impact at a national level.
Just briefly, I think that what you say in terms of accuracy is completely accurate. It's not a per se human rights convention, but because it is affecting civil and political rights such as access to justice, having the right to have a trial in which it's in your language, it really is building upon the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, but that will only be access via custom and not necessarily just access because the Rome Statute exists, even if your country signs up to it. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have a deep practice in what I would call gender complementarity on the procedural level that comes from the Rome Statute. Most of the states have agreed to change their substantive criminal law and some of their liability forms, but not necessarily all of their procedural aspects, and that's why I think we had the excellent example of them interpreting something that might be procedural, such as witness protection, in a manner which was creative but was not necessarily mandated, per se by the Rome Statute. But I really think that we should be extremely optimistic, because what happens is over a certain time span, a nation finds it, other than maybe Daesh, finds it impossible not to agree with what's becoming normalized around the rest of the world, just in terms of what substantive crimes exist. And that is a huge step compared to 50 years ago. And with the increase of the sexual violence provisions of the Rome Statute, pretty soon we're going to think that that was barbaric of us not to have recognized sexual violence as part of a crime against humanity. And that slowly has taken hold. And in that sense, your human rights and women's rights and your rights to your sexual integrity is increasing. So we have to look at it in that manner, I believe, a little less tangible.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I think we have to bring the discussion to a close. Thanks very much for your attention. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. I want to thank everyone for their comments on these different dimensions. And there's, of course, more on related themes today and tomorrow at the Palazzo Vecchio, so I hope you will take advantage of the program. But would you please join me in thanking our 4 speakers this afternoon?
solidarity among people, and especially solidarity at times of crisis or at times of difficult times. So we have to keep together and support each other.
More Europe is needed against the crisis, not more barriers.
We are invited to discuss the state of the Union. I think it is necessary for us Europeans to combine candid pride and genuine concern.
History is the best early warning mechanism. Let us never forget what happened to our countries when nationalism and populism prevailed.
We must remember that this union has been crafted by artisans, not architects.
If we spend the next 10 years trying to solve the democratic deficit, we will fail. If we spend the next 10 years trying to address the delivery deficit, there is a chance that we could succeed.
What we are trying to do in Europe right now is to create something new. And of course we are disturbing the people who are still thinking in the category of the past.
When things look the most hopeless, that they are liable to change.
Rule of law, democracy, human rights. These values will be necessary to achieve the aims.
I think it's important to be here today because this is the day of Europe.
More Europe, less Europe. In Europe, out Europe. That's the key question.
And what I can say today is that for sure this year, today, our State of the Union is stronger than it was last year.
You don't like European Union? No problem. Try European disunion. Try European implosion. Try European explosion. That's my conclusion about the State of the Union.
When facing a conflict, especially when the parties are companies, it's important to find an early solution and maintain a good relationship. That's why mediation is the best solution. When the parties involved in a conflict are from different countries, the dialogue between the different legal systems can be complicated. In this case, mediation is even more valuable. That's why in Florence, which has a long history of international trade relations, today is born FIMC, the Florence International Mediation Chamber. FIMC provides assistance at every stage of the process. Its rates are transparent and guaranteed. It has excellent international mediators, and it provides rooms for meetings. The Florence International Mediation Chamber collaborates with international prominent mediators, certified according to recognized standards, based on those developed by IMI, the International Mediation Institute, a non-profit organization engaged in the international proliferation of the mediation culture. FIMC knows that having a thorough knowledge of values and behaviors of different cultures is a fundamental prerequisite to help the parties reach an agreement in a spirit of cooperation. Based on this philosophy, the Florence International Mediation Chamber has been working to create a network of relations with the world's leading institutions active in mediation, to set up a system that can provide a valuable support to the global business world, such as the ISCM, Singapore International Mediation Center, and the AAA, ICDR, American Arbitration Association, International Center for Dispute Resolution. FIMC, the Florence International Mediation Chamber, ready to mediate in Florence.
solidarity among people, and especially solidarity at times of crisis or at times of difficult times. So we have
trying to address the delivery deficit, there is a chance that we could succeed.
What we are trying to do in Europe right now
Try European disunion, try European implosion, try European explosion. That's my conclusion about the State of Union.
When facing a conflict, especially when the parties are companies, it's important to find an early solution and maintain a good relationship. That's why mediation is the best solution. When the parties involved in a conflict are from different countries, the dialogue between the different legal systems can be complicated. In this case, mediation is even more valuable. That's why in Florence, which has a long history of international trade relations, today is born FIMC, the Florence International Mediation Chamber. FIMC provides assistance at every stage of the process. Its rates are transparent and guaranteed. It has excellent international mediators, and it provides rooms for meetings. The Florence International Mediation Chamber collaborates with internationally prominent mediators, certified according to recognized standards, based on those developed by IMI, the International Mediation Institute, a non-profit organization engaged in the international proliferation of the mediation culture.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Let me introduce myself. I am Marta Fraile. I am researcher here at the European University Institute. And today we're going to speak and to discuss about the gender gap in political participation and public opinion. And we are lucky enough to have a group of women researchers who will give us some ideas about the topic. Here to my right, we will start with Donatella Campus. She is a professor at the University of Bologna at the Department of Political Science. And she will speak about the media and how media treat women candidates in comparison to men. Then we have Virginia Lanko. She's the director of the European Institute for Gender Equality. This is a new institution which is doing hard work in producing empirical evidence about the existence of gender inequalities in Europe, even if sometimes some people deny them. They are making a great effort in demonstrating that the inequalities are there and that we can show them, okay? And then, of course, we have to fight against them. Then we have, to my extreme left, I have Jasmine Lorenzini. She's a postdoc researcher at the European University Institute, and she's going to speak about gender differences in political participation, but especially what she will focus is on studying differences between women participating in politics, okay? And finally, to my right, I have Elena Del Giorgio. She's also a postdoc researcher at the Università degli Studi di Milano. And she's going to speak about a very interesting topic, which is the extent to which can we speak about a feminist movement and in Europe nowadays and in comparison to the past, okay? So before giving the floor to Donatella, I would like to give you just 3 figures about the evidence we are going to talk today, okay? So here what you can see in this picture is the differences, the gender differences, in the extent to which people declare to be interested in politics in Europe. Now, this is evidence coming from the European Social Survey, which is a survey that is running all European countries, and comes from the wave of 2010. But we have here at the Institute a PhD student, Irene Sanchez Vittori. She is there with us, and I'm sure she's going to join the discussion. She has studied this more in depth, and she has shown that this is the case for the whole decade, from 2000 until 2016. And the evidence is overwhelming, as you can see. These are the differences in the percentage of people declaring to be interested in politics. And the differences is between men and women. So positive figures mean men advantages, okay? So we can find countries such as Spain or Czech Republic or Portugal where the differences are overwhelming. Now, why women declare to be less interested in politics than men? Why? We don't know yet, but we will discuss it. Another piece of evidence, which is complementary, regards what people know about politics, okay? So again, with the help of surveys, we know that women tend to know less about politics than men. Now, the evidence you see here comes from an index that goes from 0 to 6, okay? Where 0 is 0 correct answer, and 6 are 6 correct answer, okay? And the questions are about the functioning of the political system. For example, how long does it long a mandate, for example? Or knowledge about political actors. Do you know who is the current Ministry of Education? Okay, so in answering these kind of questions, again, women know less, or at least provide less correct answer than men. Again, this evidence comes from a survey which was collected in 2009, but many other surveys provide the same evidence. Okay? Let me give you a last figure of the same puzzle, which is an idea about how informed are people about politics. Okay? So again, with evidence coming from the European Social Survey, what you see is that women declare to be less exposed to political information in all kind of media outlets. Okay? What you can see here is one of the media outlets, newspaper readership, political information. Again, weekly average of newspapers readership is always smaller for women in comparison to men. Now, you can look at the indicator of political interest, at the indicator of political knowledge, or the indicator of political information. All of them say the same. Why women tend to be less exposed to political information, why they tend to be less interested in politics. Is this a product of socialization? It is a product of the fact that they have different experiences in their life, and then women give less priority to politics than men. It is a product of the lack of information, of the lack of time that they have, that women have in comparison to men in their adult life. There are many, many explanations, but controlling for all of these explanations, the differences always remain. Okay? So this is something that needs to be known and need to be discussed. Now I give the floor to Donatella, who is going to tell us something about why women are less exposed to political information. Not really, but something related.
But okay, thank you very much. Of course, thank you very much also for this invitation. I'm very proud to be here to talk about a topic that is absolutely important, because I'm convinced, and probably all of you share my belief, that the presence of women is absolutely a necessary condition for the improvement of the quality of democracy. So, first of all, let me say that I'm a scholar in political communication. And so today, for this very short speech, I decided to focus on one obstacle that women face, because of course the underlying question in this panel is the gender gap. We know that the gender gap is much related to the obstacles that women face when they participate in politics, when they pursue a political career. I tend to think that there is at least one obstacle that should be taken into serious consideration, and concern how media covers women politicians, because the media coverage is strongly affected by gender stereotypes. So what I'm going to say today is just to give you a brief description of media coverage, just to underline those aspects, just to show how those gender stereotypes are applied. And then I will try also to offer a tentative answer to a question that I consider important, because political communication has been changing, and so we have to ask how much the recent developments in political communication can be of help, or by contrast, they can amplify actually the sort of biases I'm going to talk to you now. So first of all, what are those biases? How media cover women in politics by applying gender stereotypes. First of all, there is the so-called trivialization effect. This means that media tend to give a very disproportionate coverage to trivial aspects that are appearance, first of all, clothing, aging, etc., etc. And this is an interesting point because sometimes this happens also at a sort of an unconscious level, because not always media criticize women. But even if the coverage is neutral, it's just a description, for instance, of the dress of the woman concerned. In any case, this is a distraction from substantial things like political ideas, political views, political activities, and the focus of attention is on things that nothing have to do with politics. And so even if the coverage is apparently the coverage is not negative, in any case this may have negative consequences for the woman concerned, because she may seem less credible, less competitive, okay? So this is a first aspect that should be taken into consideration. The second concerns the so-called family factor. What does that mean? When a woman pursues a political career, especially if she actually competes for the top levels, so for the leadership, family is always a very sensitive aspect. This happens in many possible ways. First of all, if a woman is married, if she has children, this is considered as a correct thing, because of course it conforms to traditional feminine roles. But at the same way, there is very often a speculation if she has enough time to devote to politics, because she has also family concerns. Let me give you an example, an Italian example, very recent one, probably my Italian colleague knows very well. A few weeks ago, there was a huge discussion because a candidate for mayor in Rome, a woman that is pregnant, was in some ways not attacked, because this was a typical form of benevolent sexism, but one of her oppositor said, okay, now she's pregnant, probably she would like not to compete anymore because she has to take care of her pregnancy and of her maternity. So even in this case, you may see that sometimes those gender stereotypes works in an apparent, not open, negative way, but in any case they have negative consequences. And this is not just an Italian thing. So I could mention, for instance, the comment made when Ségolène Royal launched her candidacy, and immediately Laurent Fabius, that was her oppositor, asked, and now what about her 4 children? Who will take care of them? So it's very typical. On the other hand, however, this works also in the opposite direction, because if you are single or if you are childless, this is in any case covered sometimes in a biased way, because why you don't have children? Maybe because you are too ambitious. And if you don't have a family, you can understand the problem of citizens, you can understand the problem of families. So in any case, nothing is the correct way. Nothing seems the correct way. So family is always a sensitive thing for women. And the paradox is that today, private life has become much more political for men as well. Because while in the past there was a sort of strong division between private life and public life, now also the private life of men in politics is covered by the media, but this is much less a sensitive issue. So this is another example of gender stereotypes. How many minutes I have? 5? Yeah. Okay, even less, I understand. Okay, so let me come to the conclusion at this point. I hope to have given you just an insight of possible gender stereotypes, how they work. Now, let me come to my initial question. Recent developments in political communication can be of help or can amplify all this. Because the point is that we know that today politics is much more personalized than in the past. And there is the privatization, what I mentioned before. Now private life is in some ways public, because it's more covered by the media and it's much more a matter of public discussion. We are also in the so-called era of the pop politics, because now politics is actually an issue not just for the traditional media, but also media like tabloids, popular magazines, entertaining TV programs talk about politics. Politicians tend to be covered by all these media. Of course, the kind of coverage is based more on trivial things, because that kind of coverage is more focused on appearance, is much more focused on private life. So at the end, women should be more visible today, because very often women are more covered by that kind of media, and so they very often are leading actors in the infotainment. But this of course is not the right visibility, what we are looking for, what we need. So at the end, the point is that today women and men are more pop politicians. But while this is not harmful for men, because they actually enjoy also another kind of coverage, especially in the quality press and in traditional media, for women this can actually amplify stereotypes. So I think that we have to be very cautious about this. I think women in politics should be cautious about this and should be openly claim for a fair coverage, because this is extremely important, because we need to understand that also comments that apparently are not negative can have negative effect, or in any case can act as a constraint for women's political career. I think I could. Thank you very much.
This morning, I heard a phrase in the morning that women's needs are everybody's needs. And then I started thinking, do we talk about the basic needs, about the roof, food, dental care, whatever care, and also like having a possibility to take your children to the kindergarten? Or are we talking about more strategic needs? Who am I? What is my role? How can I contribute? And where I live, can I give it to my society? And then if I thought about politics, what is politics? And does politics deal with the basic needs? Does politics deal with the strategic needs? And if I take a very rough, not a scientific definition, usually we discuss, when I explain to my grandchild, my grandson, I'm saying, we all contribute with money. That's, in the pot of the government. And then that is distributed so everybody who needs to develop the society, so the portion of everybody's together money is given to do that. And then the difference is that we talk that, yes, women's needs are everybody's needs, but we don't involve the women to decide on how those needs will be satisfied. And what we see, like we talk about, we've been doing, as it was mentioned, the analysis, and we tried to do the comparative analysis on the 28 European Union member states. What do we see? That despite increasing slowly and solidly representation, proportion of women in political decision-making, men still dominate. So it is 48 or 50% of the society who still decides on how those needs are to be met. As you see here, again, it is like the total, the average. We have, as you see, increase from 2003. It is slow, but steady, very slow increase. And as you see, regional assemblies are the biggest. National governments, where usually decide on how the budget should be implemented, which measures should be taken, are, in this sense, the lowest compared to what proportion is. We also, when we analyzed what can make the change, initiate the change, so you see from the countries, we analyzed the legislated quotas, the decision which is forcing the political parties really to take this decision, to search deliberately and find the ones who are equally good in being and taking the decisions. So as you see from the difference from 2003, the average, the horizontal stretch, and then how much the increase has been on average among those countries which have the legal quotas, legislated quotas, in order to see to that until we get the parity, which is 50-50. So until we get that, we need to do something drastically. And then if you look at those voluntary party quotas, where it is more, in some cases, like it's more maturity of the society that they don't question. Now, okay, we had a man all the time. Now it's time to have a woman party leader. Or we had now number one on the voting list, a man. Now we take a woman. So it is without legal. And you still see it is much higher. And we have a portion, a small portion of countries which don't have any quotas. And there, as you see, the difference is quite visible. The factors which usually we talk about, why people say, both in economic decision making or even in political, yeah, but you know, we don't have quality. We don't have the women who could take the lead. And usually what is? It's the culture, as we say, we analyzed, it's usually internal culture of the parties on how they decide on the voting list, how they prepare also the candidate list, how they prepare the, the party boards and all this, which is the very old tradition, everywhere the same, which is extremely big barrier really to change the attitude and think about the needs and who would decide upon them. When we looked at the EU institutions, so you see European Parliament, it was again from 2003, you see, by 6% increase, European Commission is increasing, and we also analyzed the EU agencies like the one I work for, which are independent EU bodies. They are placed in all member states. As you see, this is the lowest. And what we found out, it's the member states which appoint usually people to the EU agencies boards. And there, because of the member states where it's really much more rooted, the stereotypes, the barriers, the attitudes that do not support the women in decision making. So very often it is also a part of this why, for example, in agencies it's mostly men taking decisions. But the other thing is also, and I think it will be in the next slide, you see, we analyzed also, can it be then that the sectors, men from the segregated education, women usually study like political sciences, maybe less, but social sciences, arts, humanities, men study infrastructure, energy, the hard finances. And then if you look at the boards, you see the basic functions. So here we see it's the women presidents, or the basic functions, let's say 15%. In economic, it's more or less. Social, cultural, there is even. So, which means that already, as it was mentioned in one of the panels, we have to start from the school. We have to start so then the people would understand, and the girls, how you are teaching, what is the curriculum, how the interest is raised, so then that there wouldn't be this big segregation on the first education choices, then occupational choices, because this is also partly how the people are appointed. In the ministers, if you look at the member states, we have the reports on our web, you can easily download that. You can see for each member state how big the gap is, depending also on the maturity of the society and also voluntary attitudes. Challenges. Leaky pipeline, you must have heard about this. It's especially connected to the academia, and I don't have the data on the European University Institute, but in most cases when we analyze, this is the biggest case, but you know that women outnumber. In tertiary education, university education, it's more women than men who study, but when you go up to the level, again, who takes the decisions, who are professors, or you know, the chairs of different departments, then women drop out from the holes which somebody has made, and they are very, very small, and it really needs a change. Gender stereotypes, it was mentioned already, both not only media, but it's extremely strong. And I remember about 8 months ago, there was a big debate in Sweden about like one of the 5 biggest parties, then they had to change a leader. And there was like a woman who was highly pregnant. She was, you know, approached by the journalist and saying, oh, so you are one of the main candidates for the party? She said, yeah. So how will you manage? You will soon have to have a baby. And then she said, the baby has a father. So, and she became the party leader. And I was thinking, in Sweden it's more discussed, but in many countries, if I would think when I was talking also, they would say, you know, if the man is taking care of the children, he is a hero. If a woman does not do a small thing, then she is really judged that she cannot do anything because, I mean, she really has to fulfill the duty of the basic needs of her life, as if it is not the life of together with the family. So stereotypes are extremely valid in most countries. Work-life balance. It's again, still we did quite much also comparison of the data. If you have also long working hours, we were talking about sometimes up to 8 o'clock, and if you don't have a more like attitude in the family that you both share, you know, being and helping the children and doing the unpaid work. So in our index, which we updated last year, we saw that unpaid work, that means a man and a woman who take care of the children at least 1 hour per week, or who cook and do all the housework at least 1 hour per week, the gap has increased since 2003. So that means that instead of we are changing, we are trying to develop both in the family. It is extremely huge gap to the detriment of the women. And as I mentioned, business organizational culture, we have those attitudes which really are not acceptable, are not supportive to women working in this. And as we say, leadership positions, then it is very difficult really to get it because simply there's no chances if you have to do 23 tasks instead of 3 tasks a day. We see the pictures, you see how much a woman, whoever she is, whichever position she has to do, and unfortunately it's still here. It changes very, very slow. I think, if I remember right, 2 years ago when we did, you know, like check the data, I think it's in the Scandinavian countries, men, mostly young men, take parental leave. Now it increased by up to 19%, but in some countries it's like 1%, and it's our future. The men there in the shadow without faces, this is also a very typical stereotype that a woman, she cannot be a good leader. She has to be the mother. And not only that, if you have children, then you maybe will not be employed, but also then the typical thinking is, yeah, you know, she will be thinking about the children if they get sick or anything, so we don't get really full potential out of her. It's again as if children and family, it's only the need of the woman and not both of the family. And glass ceiling was mentioned today, but have you thought about the glass cliff? And we also did a few, we were trying to see through some studies which were done on the glass cliff, which means that very often when like a political party is in crisis, or it is some big commotion, it's some really big things, dangerous things happening, so the men do not dare to take it. So a woman is placed in a precarious position if she falls down or if she flies. And very often if she falls down, they say, oh, it's a woman, you know, what to expect. But if she flies, then okay, you know, that was the condition. So that's also a very typical challenge today. Recruitment promotion, again, for the leaders. And also, if you look at, let's say, how the promotion more at the workplace is one thing, but in the party, let's say the business culture, when it is not transparent, let's say why a person is chosen to be number 3 on the candidate list, there's no discussion, there's no criteria. We talk about quotas, there's no criteria for men. Why should be men should be number 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the woman, it's usually for the woman, okay, so what does she know? What is she capable of? So it is unwritten rules, and it's the principle which we all agree. So I showed you a bit of what we have. You can always look and see we have very much data, and the women's needs or everybody's needs, we have to really see to that they are met, and it's not one side of society which can take those decisions, and we all have to try to do that change. Thank you very much.
Can you put on the PowerPoint? Thank you very much, Marta, for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here to speak about gender and political participation. This is not my core research field, but I happen to have worked with a colleague on political participation only by women, so it will be a different view on the gender gap, and also focusing on one very specific form of political participation, that is political consumerism. And I will give you more details about this in the presentation, but first I thought, okay, the panel is about the gender gap in political participation, but maybe not everybody here today shares my interest for this topic, so I thought maybe I take a step back and say something about why should we care about women political participation and gender equality in terms of political participation. And so the first point is that political participation relates to political voice, to the possibility for everybody to express their preferences, and as Virginia said earlier, to express demands about their needs. And at the basic of democracy is the idea that every individual has the same value, equal intrinsic worth, and everybody should therefore be able to express their own preferences about the way they want society to be organized and which are the issues that should be dealt with priority. And so working on political participation by everybody, by every citizen, and not focusing on leaders or elected candidates is very interesting, because it gives this opportunity for everybody to express for themselves what they want and how they want society to be organized. And maybe in the next slide comes the first good news of the day. I was myself a little bit surprised, because I analyzed for the first time this European Social Survey data from 2014. And as you can see in this graph, the gender gap is closing. Maybe from far away you almost think there is no gender gap. But if we look a little bit more at this graph, what we also see is differences in the different form of participation. Voting is, of course, the most common, and it's often thought of as the less demanding form of political participation. And there, the gap is very small. But as you move towards the right of the graph, you see more demanding forms of political participation in the sense that they require more time. So the person needs to invest more time to engage in these forms of participation, but they also need to have more skills that they can use to engage in these forms of participation. In particular, working in a party. We see that the overall share of the population that does this is very low. But we also see there that the gender gap increases, that women tend to be less active in this form. But today, as I said, I would like to focus on political consumerism. Political consumerism is an everyday form of political participation. It is related to the choices that people make when they buy products or when they refuse to buy products for political reasons. And as I said also, I will focus only on women, because in spite of the fact that the gender gap is closing, I think that there are gender-related inequalities that affect women's political participation. And in order to see this, it is very interesting also to focus only on women. So in this next slide, we only have women's political participation, and we focus on this one form, political consumerism. And as we split the group of women simply according to their labor market status or their main activity, we see already differences. In education, young women who are in education, because I only have people who are 18 years or older, we can assume that is people who engage in higher education, so it is not surprising to find that they tend to participate more than other women. But what is also very interesting in this slide is the difference between women who are in paid work, so women who are currently employed, and women who are unemployed. The women who are unemployed tend to participate less in political consumerism. And this will be the focus of my last slides, because in the paper we wrote with a colleague, we focused on these differences between employed and unemployed women. But before I present you some evidence from my own research, I would like to say also a word about why is it the case? Why do we find these differences? And how can we explain them? And there are two most common explanations for these differences, and this is political resources and political attitudes. As I mentioned before, political resources is the time, but also the skills to engage in specific forms of political participation. Not all are very demanding, but some are. And as Marta mentioned earlier, political attitudes also play a very important role. The way women learn to be interested in politics and to acquire knowledge about politics throughout their life course. So from the family in a very young age to school, and then later on with friends and colleagues at work, they learn to be interested more or less in politics, and as we have seen, it is rather less than more. And this is an important explanation in the differences that we find in political participation. The main focus of our study was whether gender ideology. And what we wanted to say by focusing on gender ideology is that it is not only a question of the political resources that you have or the political attitudes, but it is also related to the way you think about women and men's role in society. And by this, I mean how you conceive of a woman's role in two main life spheres. On the one hand, the labor market, paid employment, and on the other, the family and care work. And the way you think about this, not only for yourself, but for women in general, affects your propensity to participate in politics. And here, what you see is a different data set. It's no longer the European Social Survey. It's a survey we did on young unemployed in European cities. And you see here the distribution on this gender ideology. So on the left, you have rare women who think that women should be more involved in the labor market than men, and men should care for their children. And on the right, you have the more common thinking about the male breadwinner, that is, women should reduce at least a little bit their work to care for their children, especially if they have young children. Here also the good news maybe is that at least half of the sample thinks there should be an equal division. This is the 0 on this graph. And here you see how this affects political participation in this one form, political consumerism. As we move from the left to the right, so that is from the the women who think that we should have a female breadwinner, so women working in paid employment, men taking care for children, to the red line, egalitarian, equal division of work, to the far right, male breadwinner, women take care of children, men work for money. The propensity to engage in political consumerism drops. So this shows that this gender ideology, the way we think about women and men's role in society, affects political participation. And now I will conclude. So the take-home message from my presentation was this idea that women do participate in politics when we consider a variety of forms of participating, and also that women form a very heterogeneous group, and we should not think about women as a single individual, but as very different profiles. And these very different profiles affect the way women participate in politics. And there is also gender action in these inequalities. Thank you.
No, sto qua. Okay, la cosa. So, good afternoon, and first of all, thank you for the invitation to Marta and to Ruth, who's not here. I'm really glad to be back at the UI, where I completed actually my PhD, which has still the same title as this presentation. I don't know why it goes like that. Well, never mind, which is what has happened to the women's movement. A very difficult and complicated question, but I'm just going to try to raise some issues and leave room for the debate. So when I applied to the UI, it was actually at the beginning on another topic, European Social Forum and other type of mobilization. Then I decided to focus exclusively on the women's movement. So I went to the beautiful UI library and hoping and thinking, of course, that I would find piles of literature and a lot of articles on the women's movement. Because after all, I thought, if I was there as a PhD, as a woman, PhD, and my supervisor was a woman, I owed a lot to the women who mobilized before me, before our generation, and who triggered changes and transformations that radically change our lives and society, of course. So I thought that I would find a lot to read. And then that's actually me in the library where I used to stay. And to my surprise, I could barely find accounts of the women's movement. Well, I could find some books in the field of political science, political sociology, and sociology, some accounts, and who dated back 84, 85, 86, or even earlier. But after that, there was basically nothing but very, very few books. So I wondered why, because I thought that can't be the case. I mean, even just a quick parenthesis, I don't know how many of you have watched the movie The Suffragette. For instance, if you think of that, most of us thought that that movement was made by bourgeois and very peaceful women who gently pushed for change. It was actually a very disruptive and violent movement, and this has been hidden somehow or forgotten. So, also about the second wave feminism, we know actually something. We know way less about what happened after that. Why? Well, few women scholars in the academia, so access to the field, of course, women could do research, carry on research on that, and there were few bringing those contents into the academia. Academia is a very, I called it a feminist-proof environment, and not only academia, also the media, as Donatella said earlier. So most accounts, moreover, were written by feminists for feminists, using a very peculiar language, so related to personal experience, that really didn't resonate much with the academic language. And then there was probably the main reason, that is that starting from the 80s, commentators, scholars, journalists had already written the obituary of the movement. So the women's movement was perceived as being dead, with no hope or need for resurrection. Why that? Well, because it was thought that we were entering the post-feminist era. It was thought that everything had been already achieved, so that the movement somehow was defeated by its own victories. Was it? Is it? So, of course, in the 70s, second wave feminism, we had visible protest, a collective protest with a transnational character, which emerged in all Western democracies. And here, I'm going to go quickly, but here you can find some common features of national women's movement around the globe. I mean, in Western democracies, and not only, of course, we had movement arising also in other countries. What is interesting is, however, that the movement is shaped in a very different way in different national and regional contexts. Just to give you an example, but we can talk more about that, we can talk of a Southern European model marked by direct action, revolutionary ideology, strong relation in Italy, especially also in other countries, between feminism and communism, and all the dilemmas that these ties implied. So what comes first, liberation or revolution, for instance? So these are the features mainly of Southern European model. Then we had the Northern European model marked by a less ideologically charged, more pragmatic somehow, with very more pragmatic goals, providing services, organizing in a more formal way. Why is it important to say that? Because the way in which the movement shaped in those years deeply, deeply affected what happened next in European countries. So this was just an example about Italy, so making clear the point before. In the 80s and the 90s, especially in the 80s, we started talking about diffused feminism. If you think about the movies, for instance, about women in careers, or the imaginary changed completely. Think about Madonna in music, and of course also in professions. Business, women enter business, enter several careers. We studied, where I work now, in Milan, medical careers. Women in medicine entered a lot in the 80s. So diffuse feminism and the debate about the very existence and definition of the women's movement. Diffuse feminism shaped differently again. So in northern countries, what it is called and known as state feminism arose, marked by, here you can see the famous velvet triangle, marked by positive relations between female sitting in the parliaments, the so-called, it's not a beautiful term, but it's useful, femocrats, those women working within gender equality bodies and institutions, and between the women's movement organizations. So these linkages and the way in which the women's movements organization in most northern countries, for instance, worked, favored the deep changes and fast changes, not only in gender equality policies, also in the relation between women and politics. If you think about, for instance, Germany, the Green Party already in 82 introduced gender quotas in their own regulations. So, and this has very much to do with the openness also of feminist organizations towards institutions, towards local administrations, for instance. Women's projects started to ask for funding and to build women's houses or projects for women migrants, something that happened really later in Italy or in other countries. Together with this, the Velvet Triangle as it was conceived in mid-90s, maybe we can add, Sylvia Walby added, and I totally agree, to other actors, so to say, women in academia and the corporate world. We were talking in the previous panel about women in business, for instance. In each of these fields, starting from the 90s and 2000 in Europe, several groups and associations and networks grew. So the women's movement somehow fragmented a lot. I remember interviewing women, for instance, in Berlin, in women's organizations, and asking, is there a women's movement? And they always said yes and no. I mean, somehow there are a lot of be-moved women by the movement. And so this fragmentation, it's actually made also of enriched somehow the way in which gender equality issues are addressed in several realms at the same time. So, and I'm gonna go quick because I think I'm late already, but then I'll leave room for questions. So, to answer to the question what happened and what's happening, can we still talk of a women's movement? Yes and no, depending on the definition. No, if we have in mind visible, constant protest, which is carried on with continuity by a collective actor that we can easily identify. And this is mostly the definition of social movements used by social movement scholars, who, as we said, rarely studied the women's movement. But the women's movement is an awkward case, because instead of having sustained mobilization, is made up of continuously working associations, networks. Think of the Women's European Lobby, who's active since the 1990 in Europe, or think about all the association working on women and politics and favoring and influencing policy making on quotas, for instance, what emerged before. So, depending on this, I'd say that, well, the women's movement appears to be nowhere right now, but while it's probably everywhere. So thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot to all of you for very interesting presentations. We would like now to discuss with you or to open the floor for questions. So please raise your hand if you have questions. And
hello, my name is Maria Roslumer from Austria, from the European Network WAVE, Women Against Violence Europe. It's also a women's movement in Europe. And my question is to Elena. It's really very interesting, your research and your work. For me, we know we have a different women's movement, and there's also a women's movement in political parties, yeah? Not only feminist parties. Yeah? And for me, the question is, what is, for example, if you, and I know the women's movement, I'm also part of women's movement, and always the question, what is the win or the profit if you are part of a women's movement? Do you have more chance to, in political parties, political, you don't hear? Really? Okay. Okay, shall I repeat it? Okay. The last question. If you, as a woman, if you are a part of the women's movement, in feminist women's movement, is there, is there more profit, or is there more chance to take part in political participation, yeah, or not? Yeah, what this is would be very interesting for me to know if you, yeah, or if you not take part in women's movement. Yeah, this is, I don't know. Maybe it's not. You cannot answer it because maybe it needs a separate survey or things like that. But this could be also very interesting. What is the win and the profit to take part in women's movement?
Thank you all for your presentations. I want to make a question that is a bit a general question to all of you, specifically maybe with regards to surveys and to social movements in the following sense. Social movement literature always asks the questions of whether there is a women's movement, and many times the answer is no, because social movement literature is gender biased. So they cannot identify a women's movement because the way the women's movement or feminist movements have developed do not fit the schema outlined by social movement theory. I'm also wondering if this is the case with studies that are derived from surveys. So are the surveys able to identify what women think of politics from a gender bias? Are they adequately reflecting what women understand as politics, or is there basically a measurement problem that is not allowing us to identify what is the reality of women's participation? So is the main mistake in the way it's being measured and analyzed, and not in the fact that women don't participate?
Well, I would like to also thank you for your presentations. I have two questions. One maybe more focused to Donatella. You were saying that there is an increasing personalization of politics, and if this personalization is further putting the attention in politicians' personal life, wouldn't this act as a further deterrent to women engaging with political, to running for office, if they don't fit the specific model that is thought for them, and which in any case they're not going to fit because running is already something that shouldn't match very well their roles as caregivers and so on. And the second would be a bit more general. I would like to ask you for your insight on how to disrupt this link between gender quotas and this criticism that is posed to gender quotas in terms of them pushing forward candidates that really don't deserve their positions because they kind of forcibly open positions for them where they shouldn't. Is there any way in which this discourse could be effectively disarmed from the different perspectives that you were dealing with? Thank you.
Thank you. Just one additional question. If to Elena, if the women's movement is everywhere, I would like to ask, which are the targets of the women's movement today? Targets, and what could be the solutions to achieve the targets? Thank you.
I think we have collected many questions, so let's try to answer some of them, and then we can do a second round of questions. Thank you. So I don't know, perhaps Elena is the most right, but we can start by Donatella. Donatella, would you like to start by answering to Irene?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm not sure that I understood your point in the sense that I hope to give you an answer. My point is that today political communication is very personalized. Not just personalized, because personalization of politics means simply that the personal factor is at the center. The point is that there have been some developments, and one of the developments is the anti-imization of politics or privatization, and the other is the so-called celebrity politics that is much linked to the polarization of politics. This means that we are in the era of pop politics, okay? This means that in any case, independently on being a woman or a man, a lot of attention is given to things that are not really so much related to politics, okay? And my point is that for a woman it's more difficult to be heard as a political actor because it's more difficult for everybody, also for men. But the point is that since there is an original bias and men have a different coverage, also more traditional coverage, so have more room of being visible as political actor, for a woman it's more difficult to be fit for the role. Of course, you can do many things to intervene in this from that point of view. But my point is that there are open gender stereotypes, so they are much more recognizable. For instance, the so-called double bind, if a woman is represented as too aggressive or too weak, but those things are more visible. Instead, the point I try to stress today are in some ways more deceitful, in the sense that, as I told you before, the coverage of some aspect like your clothing or like your appearance or just the information about your family life seems neutral things, but they distract your attention. So my main point, but I don't know if I'm answering to your question, is that a woman involved in politics should be very attentive to those aspects and to be very ready to claim for fair treatment and to say, stop please that kind of coverage, because otherwise it can be damaging for women more than for men. I don't know if I more or less answered, okay?
Elena, would you like to respond?
Oh, difficult question. But I will start from what Lucrezia was saying, because you're totally right. I mean, one of the point of my research was that social movements theory is totally biased, and that's why the women's movement was an awkward study, because it escaped somehow the categories that had been developed to study other movement and that had mainly so visible protest and contentious politics at the center, you know. And that's why, while I studied the movement, I thought that the best way to understand its complexity was to look at the organizational level, and this helps me to answer the other questions. Looking at single organizations, so the level where the micro level, so individual trajectories, meet the macro level, the structure of political opportunities, resources, and the general political climate. So that's the level where they meet. And it's the level where most changes occurred, starting from the first wave, but especially starting from the 70s. So if we use this framework, targets, let's say goals in social movements theory, are crucial. So why do we mobilize? So who are we is one of the first questions. Who are we, and what do we want? Who we are targeting? And it very much depends. So to go back to your question, it depends on the goals. Because participation to the women's movement has been, and is for certain activists, a crucial factor in paving the way for then entering local administration or the parliament. Take Italy. We had a huge mobilization, the first visible mobilization after years in 2011. I don't know if you know about that, the movement, if not now, when. And it was precisely about that. It was about fighting the stereotypes of women, on women in politics, and fighting for equal opportunities in politics, especially. It was the time Berlusconi government, the scandals with young girls and stuff. So thousands of women filled the street, and men filled the streets in those days. And if you ask me, some of the leaders of that movement entered the parliament. One is the vice president of the Senate, and some others entered local administration. But it depends on the goals of the movements. Of the organizations. There are organizations who had as, and still have as goal, more cultural achievements, and who work on, for instance, gender stereotypes in advertisement, or in other more specific topic, in women in innovation, women in science. And so it's different. But of course, in many cases, in Germany, for instance, and it was more women activists tended to work within their own projects and to have contacts with representatives. Especially in the 80s, in the 90s, that became their job. Because they asked for funding, they created very formal organizations, so that became their lives, their jobs. In Italy, we had the issue of double militancy, so women active in the movement and at the same time, mostly in the Communist Party or in trade unions. So having difficulties and solving dilemmas, having this double militancy. So it depends, but surely it has helped women to in terms of empowerment, I'd say, in terms of knowledge, in terms of networks, and of course it has helped collectively, because think about the debate on égalité in France, parity in France in the 90s, that changed completely. I mean, that brought significant transformations. And this leads to the question about targets. If we answer yes to this question, and I know it's not easy, I mean, it's if we use a broad understanding of women's movement and we answer yes, the targets for women's organizations very different. There are associations working with Dr. Langbach. I mean, we work with Eige on structural change, women in science, for instance. In Italy, there are now plenty of associations working on gender medicine, on women in innovation, and they pressure MPs, they influence policy making. There's now a law draft in the parliament on gender medicine, and this is largely due to a matrix of actresses and actors mobilizing at different levels, you know, often in not such a visible way. So targets can be multiple. What is interesting to know is that if there's a perception of threat somehow, let's take, for instance, in Italy it happened on the law for artificial reproduction linked with the abortion law. When that law was threatened by the abortion law was threatened by the law on artificial reproduction, boof. In 2006, there was a huge demonstration on the street. So those ties, those different organization and sensibilities, so people working on different topics, boom, came together, you know. So it very much depends on but I'd say that the targets are different, and what has probably changed in the past years as compared to the past is a major attention in terms of targets and goals towards politics. I don't know if you agree, but we are here talking about that. And also in organizing, I remember a famous feminist, Italian feminist, telling me a couple of years ago, we were wrong. We were wrong in Italy in the 80s. We thought what we didn't have to fight for laws, and we should have. And now we have to fight to be there, to be in the decision-making process. And this is occurring even more, and I think this is one of the target. And also more cultural changes. Think about gender violence, gender-based violence. I mean, there are a lot of groups and associations working on that. So it really much depends. I think the targets are more diversified as in the past, a bit everywhere, but ready to come together if it's needed, of course. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like also to make a comment on one of the things that were raised. I think it was Lucrezia who was raising the fact that the overwhelming majority of evidence we have in political science come from surveys which has been designed by men, by political scientists who were men, and specifically they were more or less all the questions that we use come from the 60s under the behavioral revolution in the States, and they haven't rarely been changed across time. Also because we need to know how the public opinion evolves across time. So if we change the questions, then you cannot look at this. But still, it is true. I mean, all those questions are very much male-oriented. For example, coming back to the example I was telling you at the beginning, how much people know about politics, no? All the questions that you can find in surveys deal with electoral politics or with political actors, normally men, okay? So what some evidence has shown is that it is true that women know less about politics than men when they are asked about electoral politics and when they are asked about the knowledge of political actors, men actors. But what happened when you ask them about the knowledge of all the things they need to exercise their rights, for example, which are the things that you need for getting your healthcare card, for example, or where do you have to go to get your identity card, or all these, let's say, small things, politics, that has to do with real life, of everyday life. The few surveys that contain information about this reveal that women know more than men about these topics. Moreover, if you ask people about declaring their interest about local politics, for example, women express more interest in local politics than men. So there is a lot of, there is, let's say, emerging evidence that women, it is not that women do not know about politics or are not interested about politics. They are not interested about national politics, far away from their daily life. But they care very much about specific topics, social policies, for example. So it is time to change also this. We need to, introduce questions in surveys which can allow us to understand what do really know women, what are they interested in, which are their motivations, their political motivations. The problem is that it's difficult to get financial support for doing this kind of research, because that means that you change a little bit the perspective. But it will be really interesting if someone with money is interested in this, just come and talk to us, because we will be interested in doing it. I now give the floor to Virginia.
I think maybe just to add what you were saying, I was also about just to say that you say, what do women think about politics? And now I'm taking Nordic countries. So, for example, there it's exactly what Marta is saying, that you start, usually either the women say, oh, it's dirty game, it's unhealthy competition, it's all the macho rules, and I want to have clean hands, and then they most probably don't read about politics at national level. Or usually, like in the Nordic countries, you go to the local or regional. You saw also in the slide, the regional was the highest, because you have legitimate right to be that decision maker, because it is social, childcare, infrastructure, where you place the parks, how safe it is, the elderly care. This is usually decided. And again, like in the Nordic countries, they start usually, it's also close to your home, you have your surroundings. So which means that they start getting experience, and then one day they decide to go to the national level. So it's now about the quotas, as you were mentioning, and I was thinking that usually what we saw, it doesn't have, because there are also arguments in some countries which successfully managed without this legalized quotas legislation. So it's very much the debate. So Germany, for example, did really very much public debate on how important it is, what we are losing, and media. And even when you say that very often when women are approached and then, you know, would you like to run or number 2 or 1 or so, so then it's this media exposure and all this scrutinizing and whatever small slip you make or some mistake, which is much more sensitive for some reason for women than for men. But debate is very, very big, really measure if you don't want to do the, you know, to force also the parties to see that they put, you know, every second or 30% or something for the moment.
You have more questions? We still have some minutes left. So you're welcome.
Thank you. My name is Dora Tynes. I am a former EUI student, and I come from Iceland, which I think is the only European country was not featured in the statistics here earlier, but does have a decent record in gender equality in recent years. And maybe first I would have an observation. I think it's very interesting. I'm a lawyer myself, so it's very interesting to get an insight into the world of social science. I find it pondering that we are here discussing this issue with 5 women in the panel and only a handful of men in the audience, given that this is the Mecca of European political science, this fine institute. And I think that it will be very interesting to compare this session with the session that will follow, with a panel of 4 men discussing the future of us all and what the gender balance of the room will be at that session. But that was just an observation. But perhaps talking about women's movement, I found the presentation very interesting. And my question would be, would you think that the access now to social media, to Facebook, Twitter, etc., I have the impression, at least in the Nordic countries, that social media is sort of spurring a second or third wave of women's movement, because it gives people an easier access to a platform, and it's easier to have a voice. And we see that with Twitter campaigns such as Free the Nipple, and we've also had in Iceland a campaign where women started opening up about sexual abuse or sexual violence. So would you have any comments on that? Would that be an easier platform for women of, let's say, all steps of society to get engaged?
That's a very, very interesting question. So let's say, I think social media are changing in general the way in which mobilization is occurring, and this happens for the women's gender equality issues and for other issues. But you're right that we can observe some changes. And I think in general, they help in fast responses somehow. And I monitor a bit in Italy when I get, and in Italy we have issues like Donatella rightly mentioned the debate about the pregnant mayor candidate for mayor in Rome, and that triggered boom in a huge debate and responses that starting from the social media and then the newspapers, and so on the one hand, yes, it is also a place for backlash, however. Because if you look, for instance, there's a blog called La 27ª Ora of the Corriere della Sera, the major newspaper in Italy, and if you look the comments, I mean, it's about gender equality issue, there are awful comments, but awful, and there are guys really apparently doing that all the time. I mean, really careful. So we have sort of both. I'd say that it's not only because of the social media, it's because, I mean, culturally something is changing, so the social media reflects what's also changing. Think about new fathers, you know, the new arrangements also, the new role of young fathers in taking care of children, and not so much as it go when we talk about domestic work. The share of domestic work now is not really promising yet, but we hope to go there sometime. And so, yes and no. So I think yes and no. They reflect, they can trigger changes, but if there's something already there. And so that's why I think it is very important also to study the, women's movement organizations and what's left, because when you have in order for social media to bring mobilization, you still need to have people who can then organize stuff, you know, doing stuff. Also, if not now, when they came together, because there was women who were used to organize in a square, a full square, you know, it's not enough to have. But I think you're right that it's especially in linking also transnationally. This is maybe more for civil partnerships, gay marriage, for instance. In that field, I think the social media, what happened in Ireland, in the US, and that's really helping. As to generation, the transnational link, it's also linked with the linguistic barrier, which is a bit there, because you have a lot of fragmented, rather small women's organization, and sometimes it is difficult to talk because of the language. Sometimes not so much in Northern Europe, a bit more in Italy. But surely something that need to be observed, both. I mean, backlash and responses, counter responses. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, so I would like to thank again all of you for having come, but mainly all the researchers that today came here to tell us about their research, and see you around. Thanks a lot.